Greetings, kia ora, welcome. We could talk for a lot more on this topic. I think we'll shift gear and talk more about the Israel-Palestine aspect of it. In your book, you talk about what you call a nightmare scenario, which is the one-state solution.
Not solution, reality. It's not a solution.
Well, let's talk about, because the one-state proposal has an interesting history. It goes from quite prominent but very left-wing Zionists like Magnus, who set up the Hebrew University,
Buber.
Albert Einstein.
Martin Buber.
Yep, yeah. Martin Buber, of course. All had the vision of a binational state. And now the Palestinians are talking about a binational state, a state of all of its citizens.
Some Palestinians.
Some Palestinians.
It's not the official position by any means.
That's right, and particularly Palestinians outside of Palestine, I think. What is it that horrifies you about? I mean, in one sense, it's already a reality. Israel occupies the West Bank with, I've forgotten, is it 4 million?
2.5 million. West Bank.
West Bank, 1.8 million in Gaza, which most of the world believes Israel occupies, Israel doesn't.
Which we've decided we no longer occupy, but that's an argument we have with the world, yeah.
So, as you say, it kind of already exists, except it is completely undemocratic. There's no democratic input from a large part of the population. What is it that worries you about the scenario?
First of all, this is not a static scenario. I place us on a slippery slope, moving increasingly toward a one-state reality. By no means a solution, but a reality, which will, under present and for near-term foreseeable circumstances, be either not democratic, that is, Palestinians will have fewer rights, fewer national rights, or no longer a Jewish Zionist state because everyone will have equal rights, and this will have to be understood as some sort of binational reality. Now, there are very few Israelis who want this. There are some on the far right and the far left.
The president, I think. The president.
President Rivlin is a Democrat. But he's also someone who believes that we have to control the greater land of Israel, and ostensibly wants to give Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, not Gaza. Nobody puts Gaza on the map of what's under Israeli control anymore. Nobody in Israel. So he says they'll all have equal rights, and when confronted with the prospect that this will be the end of Zionism, because Israel will no longer be the home of the national home of the Jewish people, he begins hedging his bets. Well, Palestinians will have to qualify, they'll have to pass some voting standards. He quite frankly doesn't know how to work his way out of this. And in any case, in our system, he has no constitutional power to do anything about it, which is one of the reasons he was elected president.
It's interesting that someone from the right, like him, is talking on those.
Look, you have, and I outline this in the book, among the right, which is the dominant political element in Israel, which is today the political mainstream, you have a huge variety of points of view as to how to solve this issue, how to deal with it. Rivlin is one extreme. You can find fascists at another extreme who just want to kick people out. You can find others who say they'll be under Israeli rule, but they'll have Jordanian citizenship and vote in Jordan. They don't bother to ask the king of Jordan whether he's interested in having more Palestinians on his voter list. You have one who's a very prominent columnist for the Jerusalem Post, Caroline Glick. She's my favorite because she says, well, all the demographers are wrong. Palestinian demographers, Israeli demographers, international demographers, there aren't 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. There are only 1.5 million. She knows.
This always fascinates me, this idea that because someone is Jewish, like I could make the right of return, an Iraqi Jew from, well, let's take a Syrian Jew now, I mean, a Syrian Palestinian can't go back to where they came from, but they surely have as much in common with an Iraqi Jew now living in Israel. They're the same language, the same music, the same culture, basically.
The Iraqi Jew living in Israel, you're talking about his grandchildren who don't know Arabic anymore. They have to be taught Arabic.
That itself is a tragedy that's happened. But what I'm saying is that this saying that a recent Russian immigrant is somehow inherently more in common with anyone who describes himself as Jewish or can have the right of return. For instance, my children could go to Israel and live there. Even though they have 2 passports already, they could also have an Israeli one because they have one Jewish grandparent. The Palestinian in Syria at the moment, and you write about it in the book, can't go back to where their parents came from, even possibly themselves, in Israel, because you're so terrified of this idea of the demographic threat. In any other country, in Vienna, where my grandparents came from, they did talk about the demographic threat. And they were worried about Jews, too many of them. I don't really understand why is a Palestinian, just because they're a Palestinian, a threat to a democracy?
Not just because they're Palestinian. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. It's the only one in the world. We consider ourselves a Jewish people, not just a Jewish religion. This is an issue of profound discussion with the diaspora, with many diasporas, and I fully understand that there are plenty of Jews in the diaspora who have a hard time getting a grip on this, okay? We have more international legitimacy as the homeland of the Jewish people than virtually any country in the world has international legitimacy, because we were created by the League of Nations, the Balfour Declaration, and the United Nations, okay? The United Nations offered the Palestinians a state. They and all their neighbors turned it down in 1948 and said, no, we prefer to destroy the Jewish state, and we do not accept this offer. And they have continued ever since to turn down offers of a state.
But
now,
if we look at that first offer...
If 5 million... First of all, you talk about the Palestinian refugees in Syria. According to UNRWA statistics, there are over 5 million such refugees. Only about... The last count I did was 5-6 years ago. Only about 40,000 were born in what's today Israel. We're talking about the great-grandchildren of people who fled, and let's be honest with ourselves, in some cases were expelled in the course of the 48 war, because that's what happens in war. Refugees are created. Look.
How many generations do you think you need to go back in our lives, in our families, to get ourselves back to Israel?
The point I'm making is that the Arab world made sure from 48 till today, through UNRWA and other devices, not to absorb these people and to create a situation where a great-grandchild will hold up a key and say, I have the right of return to Israel. And why? Because if that person has the right of return to Israel, then the state of Israel was born in sin in 1948. Because all other countries solve their refugee issues differently, except for the Arabs and the Palestinians.
Don't you think?
And if the state of Israel was born in sin, then there's no justification for our existence. And I, as a Zionist, and most Israelis, do not accept this and reject it.
I would disagree in the sense that I think every colonial settler state, and I include Israel, and that you may not, but New Zealand, America, Australia, we're all born in sin. I take that for granted. You have these unequal forces. When you say the Palestinians refused, the figures I gave before, 1.5 million people being expected to take less than half for a population of 500,000. In hindsight, I'm sure they wish they had taken it, so do I, but it seems utterly unrealistic to expect anyone to accept that.
Did you know that the Peel Commission in 1937 offered the Palestinians 82% of the land? Did you know that the United Nations in 1947 offered them 52% of the land? And it goes on and on and on, but never ending, because the purpose of the Arab insistence on the refugee right of return is to continue to delegitimize Israel in order not to come to terms with it. This is the logic behind it. Look, Jeremy,
okay, but that is a standard.
My mother, whom I mentioned in the border debate, by the way, some of you may remember the village of Szeged in Hungary. My mother fled the province of Galicia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. She was a refugee. She got to Vienna, she was recognized as a refugee. Does that give me rights? Do I have a right to go back and take the family mill on a little stream somewhere in Galicia? It doesn't give me rights, and I'm a second generation, if you like, refugee. This is a ridiculous discussion.
I don't think
the Arabs have taken it ad absurdum. Ad absurdum. And the point I make in the book is that the Palestinian refugees in the Yarmouk camp next to Damascus, they used to be about 400,000 strong. Now there are a few thousand left, okay? Their origins are from the Galilee, northern Israel. The people in Yarmouk, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, still claiming the right of return. They have now been swept up in a wave of 12 million Syrian refugees scattered all over the Middle East. It's high time to change that everybody dealing with Middle East refugees change the concept and recognize that this is a huge problem. You have Palestinians, you have Syrians, you have Iraqis, you have Kurds, you have Yemenis. There's absolutely no end of it. And it's time to stop dealing separately with the Palestinian refugee issue. UNRWA was created exclusively for them. Everybody else has the High Commission of Refugees. It's time to bring this all together and put paid to the whole refugee right of return issue in the Israeli-Palestinian context. Because it is one of the main obstacles to being able to resolve anything.
It is certainly a major obstacle. You mentioned that you couldn't go back. My ancestry came from Austria more recently than yours. It was the Second World War. It was the Holocaust that brought my family here.
And your family was absorbed, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
That's what's done with refugees of war, except in our case. Although we absorbed the same number of Jews fleeing Arab countries in the early 1950s, we never even called them refugees. We never registered them as refugees.
There's a whole other debate around that, and to what extent that Israel contributed in some cases to those people, like the Iraqi case, where some Iraqi Jews in Israel now claim...
They're lining up to go back to Iraq, aren't they?
Well, that tells us something about intervention as much as anything else. We're coming up to question time shortly, so I think I'll ask one more, and then we will move on. BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. International movement now, very controversial. Is there any element of it that you support? Is there, by putting pressure on Israel, you support a two-state solution, you want to see a two-state solution? Do you support some aspects of the BDS movement?
I don't support boycott, okay? We were boycotted for decades after the State of Israel came into existence in 1948 by an organized Arab boycott, which was respected and honored by all kinds of international firms. It just made us stronger, by the way. It just gave us more indigenous manufacturing and agricultural capabilities. But I don't believe that boycott is going to change anything in the very, very complex and somber Israeli-Palestinian reality. It's not going to stop this slippery slope. Now, BDS, there are some who want to boycott only settlements and their goods, and others who want to boycott the entire state of Israel, and others who are violently anti-Zionist. On the other hand, there are a few Zionists involved in BDS. They're just against the settlements. I would argue, and let me note, I don't pretend to be an expert on BDS. I do pretend to know something about how Israel interacts with the international community. I would argue that BDS is much more of an issue outside of Israel. For example, on campuses in the Western world. Much more of an issue outside of Israel than it is inside of Israel. And it will, under no circumstances is it going to be decisive in deciding the outcome of the Israeli-Palestinian slippery slope. And if you watch our prime minister, who bears a large portion of responsibility for the slippery slope, but who is also rather astute, politically certainly, and cautious internationally, he is building up Israel's alternatives to any sort of boycott coming from primarily Europe, because the United States is neither Trump nor Clinton are going to adopt BDS.
It brings us a sense to the new periphery you've been speaking of,
Even
Saudi
beyond
Arabia,
the new
China.
periphery. I mean, we're no longer isolated, okay? We have strategic relations with Russia, with China, with India. We have growing strategic relations even with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. None of them are in the slightest bit interested in BDS. Some of them pay lip service to the Palestinian issue. The other Arabs are thoroughly fed up with the Palestinians never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I mentioned a few of them in terms of percentages. And all of these give Israel, along with the United States, which is still Israel's primary international ally and friend, all of these, I would argue, render the BDS movement more of an issue for hand-wringing in the diaspora than in Israel itself.
And let's give Yossi a big thanks.
Thank you.